In this podcast episode, Dr. J. Bhattacharya, director at the National Institutes of Health, NIH, and professor of health policy at Stanford University, discusses various topics including the impact of COVID-19 policies on public trust, vaccine efficacy and safety, and the controversial debates surrounding lockdowns and school closures. Throughout, he advocates for reforming scientific culture to promote transparency, innovation, and open discourse, with a hopeful vision for the future of public health research. Dr. J. Bhattacharya opens the discussion by emphasizing the core mission of the National Institutes of Health, NIH, to advance the health and longevity of the American people. He highlights that while the NIH is primarily a U.S. institution, its research impacts global health. The NIH is recognized worldwide as a premier biomedical research organization responsible for funding foundational basic science that underpins nearly every medical treatment available today. A significant portion of NIH funding supports basic research, studies that explore fundamental biological processes without immediate clinical applications in mind. Dr. Bhattacharya stresses the importance of this basic science, noting that many breakthroughs, such as the discovery of DNA's double helix structure, were not initially aimed at curing diseases, but ultimately revolutionized medicine. The NIH also funds applied and clinical research, but the balance between these areas is delicate and often debated. The private sector typically funds late-stage clinical trials, while the NIH fills gaps in early-stage and basic research that lack commercial incentives. A detailed explanation is provided about indirect costs, IDC, which are additional funds universities receive on top of direct research grants to cover infrastructure, administration, and maintenance. These costs support essential but non-specific expenses like lab space, utilities, and compliance with safety regulations. Dr. Bhattacharya explains that IDC rates vary widely among institutions, with some universities receiving over 50% extra on top of grant money. The system creates a ratchet effect. Universities with strong research programs attract more grants, which in turn fund their infrastructure, enabling them to attract even more scientists. This concentration of federal research dollars in a few elite institutions, mostly on the coasts, leaves many capable scientists at less wealthy universities struggling for resources. The debate over IDC rates is not about whether federal support for universities is appropriate, but how it should be fairly and efficiently distributed to foster a diverse and geographically broad scientific community. Dr. Bhattacharya sheds light on the NIH's peer review process, where panels of expert scientists evaluate grant proposals. These study sections are critical gatekeepers determining which research projects receive funding. While this system ensures expert evaluation, it also tends to favor safer, incremental research over bold, high-risk ideas. The pressure to secure funding often leads scientists to propose projects with guaranteed outcomes rather than innovative but uncertain hypotheses. This conservatism in funding decisions slows scientific progress and discourages young investigators from pursuing groundbreaking work. The system rewards grantsmanship and the ability to produce steady streams of publications, which can perpetuate incrementalism. Dr. Bhattacharya advocates for reforms that would encourage risk-taking and support early career scientists who are statistically more likely to introduce novel ideas, thereby revitalizing the pace of discovery. The conversation turns to the replication crisis, the widespread inability to reproduce many published scientific findings. Dr. Bhattacharya explains that this crisis is not primarily due to fraud, but arises from the inherent difficulty of scientific research combined with incentive structures that reward positive, novel results over replication and transparency. Negative or null results are rarely published, and replication studies are undervalued, leading to a literature that often contains false positives. He proposes a three-pronged approach to address this. First, funding replication studies as a legitimate and prestigious scientific endeavor. Second, establishing dedicated journals or platforms for publishing replication and negative results to make them accessible and respected. And third, incorporating measures of pro-social scientific behavior, such as data sharing and participation in replication efforts, into evaluations of scientific productivity. These changes would realign incentives toward truth and reliability, reducing the prevalence of irreproducible research. Dr. Bhattacharya reflects on the COVID-19 pandemic's profound effect on public trust in science and public health institutions. He recounts his vocal opposition to lockdowns, mask mandates, and vaccine mandates, positions that were controversial and led to professional and personal challenges. The pandemic exposed failures in communication and policy, including inconsistent messaging about masks and vaccines, which fueled skepticism and division. He argues that the scientific community's reluctance to admit mistakes and engage in open debate contributed to a loss of credibility. The suppression of dissenting views and the enforcement of uniform messaging, while intended to protect public health, ultimately alienated large segments of the population. Dr. Bhattacharya calls for a culture shift that embraces transparency, acknowledges errors, and fosters respectful discourse to rebuild trust. One of the most contentious topics discussed is the efficacy and consequences of lockdowns, particularly school closures. Dr. Bhattacharya points out that while many countries implemented strict lockdowns, Sweden notably kept schools open for children under 16 and experienced no worse COVID-19 outcomes. He highlights data showing that school closures caused significant educational setbacks, especially for minority and working-class children, with long-term implications for their health and well-being. He criticizes the public health authorities for ignoring mounting evidence against school closures and for vilifying those who opposed them. The lockdowns, he argues, were a luxury of the laptop class and disproportionately harmed vulnerable populations. The failure to hold open scientific discussions on these policies at major universities and public forums contributed to misguided strategies and public disillusionment. Dr. Bhattacharya provides a nuanced analysis of COVID-19 vaccines, emphasizing what was known from randomized controlled trials in late 2020. These trials showed that vaccines reduced symptomatic COVID-19 for a limited period, primarily benefiting older adults at higher risk of severe disease and death. However, the trials were not powered to conclusively demonstrate mortality reduction, especially in younger populations, and did not assess transmission reduction or long-term effects. He critiques the public health messaging that implied vaccines would provide permanent immunity and eradicate COVID-19, which was not supported by the data. This overpromising led to mandates and social divisions with significant consequences for civil liberties and public trust. Dr. Bhattacharya stresses the importance of honest, evidence-based communication about vaccine benefits and risks, including recognition of rare adverse events like myocarditis in young men. The discussion acknowledges the complexity of vaccine hesitancy, fueled by legitimate concerns about safety and long-term effects. Dr. Bhattacharya notes that while some adverse events have been documented, such as myocarditis, the overall safety profile of vaccines remains under continuous study. He calls for rigorous, transparent research into long-term vaccine effects and encourages open dialogue with the public. He also affirms the reality of long COVID as a genuine health issue, though its prevalence and mechanisms remain under investigation. The NIH is committed to supporting research that clarifies these conditions and informs prevention and treatment strategies. Dr. Bhattacharya advocates for treating vaccines like any other medical intervention, evaluated honestly for benefits and harms without ideological bias. The podcast addresses the sensitive topic of vaccines and autism. Dr. Bhattacharya acknowledges the discredited Wakefield study that falsely linked vaccines to autism and the subsequent loss of his medical license. He points to large, well-conducted epidemiological studies, such as those from Denmark, that found no association between MMR vaccination and autism. Recognizing the rise in autism diagnoses, Dr. Bhattacharya stresses that the causes remain unclear and likely multifactorial. He announces a new NIH initiative to fund open-minded, rigorous research into autism's etiology, involving collaboration with affected communities. This initiative aims to explore a broad range of hypotheses, including environmental exposures and biological mechanisms, free from political or ideological constraints. Throughout the conversation, Dr. Bhattacharya emphasizes the need to reform the culture and incentive structures of science. He advocates for supporting early career scientists, encouraging risk-taking, and valuing replication and transparency. He highlights the dangers of groupthink, careerism, and the publish or perish mentality that stifle innovation and honesty. He envisions a scientific enterprise where truth-seeking is paramount, dissent is welcomed, and failures are treated as learning opportunities rather than career-ending events. This cultural shift is essential not only for scientific progress, but also for restoring public trust in science and public health.